Emmanuel Daniel, welcome to Partnering Leadership. And you are coming to us from Kuala Lumpur. What time is it there right now?
It's 3 a.m. here. I keep all times of the day because I'm traveling all the time. So tomorrow I will be in London. Might as well just get used to the time I'm going to be in. But right now, actually, I'm in the city where I was born, where I don't really spend enough time. I do have an office here, but my entire adult life was in Singapore, which is about 300 miles down south. And then I also spent a lot of time in China, in Beijing, which is 2,000 miles up north and in New York. So divide my time between these different phases.
So, Emmanuel, the audience will primarily hear this episode, but any of them that get a chance to go on YouTube and actually see your image, they will see your radiant smile even at 3 a.m. That energy is part of who you are. Now, you also mentioned the fact that you have grown up in different places and traveled in different places. Would love to know how some of those experiences and travel have shaped who you've become.
When I put my finger on the one most important quality that defines me, I would say I'm cosmopolitan, I'm ecumenical, I'm all absorbing. And a lot of that has to do with my growing up. The country where I grew up here in Malaysia is very multicultural. And then so is Singapore. We both used to be one country before. And the way that these countries describe themselves is we have the Chinese, the Malays, the Indians, and then the others, different ethnic groups. And in both countries, I was always a minority. In the Indian community, I was born here. I make a big distinction between being Indian from India, which I'm not. And I've had a Judeo-Christian upbringing. We grew up speaking English because we were post-colonial. My neighbors were Chinese and Malay and everything else. And that's influenced a lot of my own ability to absorb different cultures.
Now, you have an outstanding book, The Great Transition, about the personalization of finance.
I started this business called The Asian Banker in 1996. Over many years, it's nearly 30 years now, that I've had the opportunity to meet with chairmen of banks in many different countries, everything from Japan to the US to the UK. In fact, the foreword to my book was written by former Congressman Barney Frank, who co-authored the Dodd-Frank Act, which regulates banking in the US and a lot of the parts of the world, and Dick Kovacevich, who was the founding chairman of Wells Fargo. So when I was writing my book, I wanted to make a difference by taking a judgment call as to where the future of finance was heading, and especially with the technology that was impacting it and so on. And the conclusion that I came to was that the technology was personalizing finance. In other words, it's putting the power in the hands of the individual to be able to control his transactions, manage his transactions, and decide which of the institutions he wanted to interact with. So that's just a theoretical basis of that. In reality, when you think about what cryptocurrency does today, it does exactly that, which is you and I can transact a crypto transaction without a financial institution in between us. The technology makes that possible. So I use this ice trade analogy because in the old days, just imagine the ice was traded by sawing it out of the lakes, putting it on horse-drawn carriages, and taking it to the city where, it's consumed. And today, where do we get our ice? We get it in the refrigerator. It's well within our control. We get it when we want it and so on. So I use that to help people imagine what I mean by personalization. In terms of where it's heading, actually, by the time I completed the book, I said, oh my goodness, it's not just the finance industry that's being personalized. It's all of society is becoming personalized. And it's putting a judgment call on the institutions that play an intermediary role. So I'm telling the large institutions that the rules of the game is being changed on them. So they need to reconfigure and rethink the whole intermediation business. In fact, I put my finger on that. And even after having written the book, I think a lot about and I observe very closely how traditional financial institutions and traditional institutions of any kind being disintermediated because of technology. And also how society itself is looking for new rules by which people interact with each other. Because when society is personalized, it puts a lot of pressure on communities and the traditional institutions that we know, whether it's a church, a school, the government, the state, and we all have to deal with the pressures that individualization is puts on society. And when I look at the US, it may look like a very harsh society today. And that's only because it's the firstborn child of the internet era. The US more than any other country in the world. And it's paying the price where there's an extreme communal upheaval as society tries to figure out how to operate and function in a highly personalized framework. So I started by writing a book on finance. And by the time I ended writing it, I realized that I was talking about all of society. And then from there, we start talking about, okay, so what should institutions do? And what would business models look like in the future and so on.
You mentioned a couple of words there. You mentioned personalization and disintermediation. Would love for you to briefly explain each, and then what are examples of the ways you see them impacting our organizations and society?
But the thing about personalization is that traditionally, and finance is the best example of this, a bank stands in between two people transacting with each other. If I'm sending you money, I send it to a bank and the bank gets it to you. Now, when you take the bank out of the picture, then the bank has to figure out why it needs to be in that transaction, that it needs to play the role of an intermediary. And in the same way, in any form of business, the state has to figure out why it needs to be an intermediary in holding society together. Because the network effect of society is able to hold together in its own right. And one of the examples I use in my book is I like dancing, I like Latin dancing. I started learning that as an adult. But one of the nice things I like about dancing is that wherever I go in the world, whether I'm in Singapore, I can go to Tokyo, I can be in LA, I can go to Colombia. And a cross-body lead is a cross-body lead in Singapore, and as much as it is in Colombia. So when I'm leading a woman to do what I want her to do, she immediately detects what I'm trying to do and she responds accordingly. And likewise, any two dancers anywhere in the world, the same rule applies to ballroom dancing, tango, whatever. And then you ask yourself, guess what? There are no global organizations somewhere, a committee on team dance movement that decides that it's 2 steps left and then 3 steps right, and then you do enchufla, and then you send the lady on off on her own. There's no committee that decides what this is. So how is it that every dancer everywhere in the world knows what that movement means? And then on top of that, in the dance fraternity, these steps they evolve over time. In Latin dance, for example, you've got salsa, but then you also today have kizomba and zouk and so on. They're just changing all the time, and all the new rules are being agreed upon by the community of dancers around the world without anyone having to say anything. And that's one fascinating aspect of society where there is no government and there's no committee and there's no intermediary that decides, but all of society just understands what it is. So the ability of society to organize, to agree on commonalities, to capture nuances, mores, and what's right and what's wrong and all of that is far more powerful than we imagine. It's just that all of us have become conditioned that we need a state to help us govern and to set rules and to set the norms and the practices that each of us understands. And the same thing applies to language, right? So language is a living framework by which we communicate with each other. And in a lot of ways, there are no governments, although for every language you do have government-sponsored agencies that try to legitimize what's right or what's wrong. But actually what they're really doing is just keeping up with how society is reformulating itself. Now, what I say in my book is that society is moving from markets orientation to networks. And the more networked we are, the power of the relationships are in the network and not in the institutions that hold the network together. And in fact, that whole idea is something that I borrowed from Rand Corporation political or social scientist who wrote this paper in the 1990s before the internet became popular. And it was during the days of the fax machine. But so the fact that the Rand Corporation was able to think about how society itself is in transition. So we proposed the social scientist that I quote in my book proposed that society moves from its tribal orientations to institutionalized and then to markets and then to networks. So tribal, we all understand that we can only relate to people who look the same as us and ethnically, literally like each other. And we are geographically good. And then when we institutionalize our belief, our learnings and so on, we're able to relate to people who are different from us. And so that's the institutionalized space. And then when we start doing trade with people who are so far away, so different from us, we move into the markets economy. And right now, a lot of humanity and civilization, it's in the market space. In the network phase, which is what the internet is making possible, we increasingly network with each other, and the assets that we are transacting with each other are increasingly digitized. And the valuation of a digitized asset is different from the valuation of a markets asset. So in a markets environment, if you had something to sell to me, a house, for example, both of us have to transact at the highest possible value and at the lowest possible value. And when the transaction is done, you lose something, I gain something. In the markets, in the networks phase, we need to share the asset. And the more the asset is shared between multiple users, the asset gains its value from there. The dimensions by which we do our valuation and the way in which we network has new rules that are different from what we are accustomed today. Now, in finance, where we see it is in the phenomenon today of meme stocks, for example. In the days of the markets economy, the institutions had a lot more control and influence over the valuation of stocks. They trade with each other, they establish the benchmark valuations of assets, and everybody else takes they call it price seeking from these institutions. But we've now reached a phase where thousands of individuals acting in concert in a network environment are just as powerful as the old investment banks, the Wall Street players in setting these prices and creating these valuations. We're still in nonsense phase of that evolution. We call that meme stocks. Meme stocks meaning that the prices go up irrationally, influenced by an irrational coming together of thousands of individual investors who are now as powerful as the investment banks in creating the valuation. And then in a lot of the meme stock cases, they come and they go very quickly. They are temporal and they're ephemeral. There are many new qualities in the way in which society holds together and assets are valued, which didn't exist before. So those are the things by which I mean personalization and disintermediation.
And this is a huge transition. Wanted to share a couple of thoughts with respect to that, Emmanuel. First of all, the quote that I love: the future is already here, it's not evenly distributed, in that some of these are signs of the future that people might not recognize in their environments, their organizations. Then Louis Rosenberg, who's one of the pioneers of virtual reality, runs unanimous AI, talks about swarm intelligence. That will be the power more than artificial intelligence as we know it. Now, I do want to understand one aspect of it before moving on. I heard some of the same concepts around whether the Facebooks of the world, the formerly Twitter, now X's of the world, where it's the power of the group But it seems like those platforms have centralized, and therefore there is still central power. There hasn't been the kind of decentralization that some were talking about before. Do you see this as something that we are slowly moving toward? It's been a step backward with some of the centralization. Where do you see these platforms fitting into that future decentralization as you see it?
So we transition through the platform phase where the power, the relationships, the data, the information, all the interactions take place on platforms. And what I say in my book is that the platforms are now starting to disintegrate. Platforms were a creation of the early days of the internet where, HTTP created this amazing platform technology on which all of the billion-dollar players from Facebook, Amazon, everybody exists. We are now at an inflection point where, because of blockchain technology, because of the technology, not the asset itself, the power is devolving into the individual. So the beauty of crypto, for example, is that it's not that Bitcoin could go up to $70,000. It's that any one of us can create our own crypto. In other words, any one of us can create our own platform on which we invite our own community to interact with us. And we will see this transition working its way through over many years from now, like maybe the next 10 to 20 years. Now, AI is also meant to be highly individualized. However, because of the relationship between Microsoft and ChatGPT, they are trying to make AI operate on platforms and keep the centralization going. But the interesting thing is that Sam Altman himself is a very interesting character, okay? Because on the one hand, he is sleeping with the devil, which is Microsoft, to be able to deploy ChatGPT on a platform. At the same time, he's the founder of something called WorldCoin, right? Which is to devolve relationships so that each of us can create communities around ourselves and create our own platforms and then project ourselves from that. So he's actually on two trajectories and playing both sides. And on the technology front, to understand this, you really need to make a distinction between Web 3.0, which is Tim Berners-Lee, and Web 3, which is Sam Altman. One continues to keep the power in the hands of the platforms that you're talking about, and the other devolves it to the individual, where every individual creates his own platform and his own communities. And I that for a while, both options are going to be evolving over time. Do you realize that we don't post on Facebook very much? The people who have been idle and the people who have been accustomed to platforms are now gaining a mindset where we rather have communities around ourselves. And we're looking for the technologies that enable us to create our own platforms and our own ability to control who we interact with and so on. So we are right now at just that inflection point where both of these options are going to be operating alongside. And the platforms themselves are not carry long form content. They carry a little bit of everything so that we know what's out there, and then enabling us to create our own platforms and our own communities around ourselves. So that's what I see taking place. How this plays out is that while the platform players continue to have a role, and it's the easier path of least resistance to creating communities, they become less profitable over time. In fact, I think it was 2 years ago that Facebook started to lose customers. It's in decline. The number of customers that stopped growing, they're in decline, and they're handing that over to new platforms like TikTok, which actually has a much shorter attention span. So TikTok arguably is not a relationship building platform. It's the content control platform where it just ensures that you're kept abreast of many different things taking place all at once. You cannot become a heart surgeon or a scientist learning on TikTok. You have to do that on another platform where you have greater control over the content that you're creating. So I think we are in a transition, and that's why I titled the book is The Great Transition. We are in a very important transition, and it shows itself up by the way which platforms can commercialize and the opportunity to commercialize on all many different types of technologies that are evolving. And that's also why lots of people don't understand how is it that Bitcoin can go up to $70,000 and potentially even more. It's the network effect that enables an asset to gain the valuation the more people are networked with each other. And the funny thing is that will have its own story. And I'm not saying that it's going to be $1 million or something like that, but that's where the valuation of crypto is right now. The functionality of crypto hasn't been created very much yet, but that will come over time. And that's a function of something else that's happening in finance, which is that the trust of the state to provide valuation to fiat currency, for example, is eroding very fast. And society is finding its own form of the same rules that I talked to you about dancing is now coming into reality through the network effect in finance.
These are huge shifts, Emmanuel, with lots of consequences, whether on a societal level, on the countrywide level, within communities. But I want to narrow it down to the perspective of executives, organizations, and organizational leaders as they see these massive shifts that you're talking about. So, in this great transition, what will be the impact on organizations and on organizational leaders? How can they be most effective in leading themselves and their organizations through the transition?
The one point that I would put my finger on to help an executive understand this transition and deal with this reality is to embrace the network effect. The rules of the network effect are already in play. Embrace it, don't deny it, don't push it back, don't postpone it, and become native to it. So we are still in the early days when the early adapters of the network effect are the gamers and even the fraudsters, the shady part of the world. The funny thing about the dark web is that if you go into the dark web, it's actually got more rules of engagement than the open web. And the reason is precisely because people don't know each other on the dark web. The need to be trusted is much, much higher. When you take Silk Road, for example, and all the other platforms that exist, they even have rules for customer satisfaction, whether you got the cannabis that you bought from an anonymous person on the other side of the world, and so on. So the need for trusted interaction is much higher. And arguably, the ability to track transactions and put people in jail because you can actually track that is actually much higher in the dark web than it is in the open web. So we need to start embracing all the new rules that are coming into effect on the network effect. And in cybersecurity, for example, it's different from the good old days when you would have a branch where you needed to lock your doors at 5 p.m. and make sure that nobody gets in. Today, it's 24/7, and the only security that you would have on anything that you put on the internet is to have it networked as much as possible. So that becomes the security. So you have to keep your door open, but it's the network effect that creates the certainty and the security of the transaction. In fact, that's what makes coin secure. So one of the questions being asked right now is whether generative AI or quantum computing, for example, will create the power of technology such that will you one day be able to crack the encryption code that makes some of these cryptocurrencies? And the answer to that is the encryption becomes nearly impossible to crack, even with quantum computing power, because it's highly networked and is safeguarded by the network users all interacting and keeping an eye on each other. So the rules of engaging in the network world closely different from the physical world or even the general internet world that we've become accustomed to. So that's the advice that I'll give the average executive trying to embrace and become native over time. So when we track technology like non-fungible assets, for example, and the banking system right now, even as we speak, is setting the stage to play a role in the NFT, in the crypto, in the digital asset space. So they want to be custodians of digital assets, and they also want to be market makers in using the network effect to find the valuation for different assets. So they're all early players into this new network effect, and they're learning as they go along. And as these industries become larger and the assets that they carry become more substantive. So a lot of what's on NFT right now are gaming assets, little tokens that kids exchange with each other and put a valuation on. For a sword, you pay $300 and so on. But eventually it will also include mortgages, bonds, treasury assets, and so on that we transact as if it's a market, except it's not a market. It's a network community finding the valuations with each other. So we are well on the way there in that way. And the way to become native to it is to embrace it, to understand its rules that are different from what we are accustomed to, and then go on to the right because the new asset classes are coming on stream right now.
To understand it, you use some fun examples, Emmanuel, and you think Taylor Swift is becoming an economic force in part by her understanding of some of this transition.
Oh, I only knew about Taylor Swift somewhere at the beginning of this year because she was coming into Singapore where I live. And I said, who is this person? And I really needed to understand. And my songs, I must say that I'm so embarrassed to know the songs that I grew up with because the future generation is already there with their own rendition of what they want to capture in their singing and so on. So I made it a point to study Taylor Swift. And actually, alongside Taylor Swift, the K-pop bands, for example, who are just as big as Taylor Swift. And when I study them, again, what I said about the network effect, we have to embrace the rules by which these industries are being created. I'll say something about Taylor Swift. Because there is nowhere to hide in the network effect, the most important currency to build any business is authenticity. Just be yourself and let the market decide. And they decide by validating with each other who they think you are. So there's no where you can hide and where you can build your own idea of who you are. And just by being yourself, you can become a huge phenomenon. And the whole idea of Swiftonomics today is that she goes to any city. Like in the 6 days that she was in Singapore, she created an economy that's more than $1 billion just in that one city. And then she repeats that in many other cities. And you ask how it is that Taylor Swift became as powerful as she is just by being herself. And if you follow her story, she started by wanting to be a country singer. She was rejected by all the label players at that time. And all she did was just post her songs on MySpace and Instagram eventually and so on, and created that community that were her followers. And then that community just built on the network effect. And it's exponential, the growth that comes from being out there. And yes, there is a time frame as well in that she started when she was 16 and now she's 34 or something like that. So it takes all of that time to snowball that community and that asset class grows on its own. So that's a fascinating example that is worth studying for any executive actually.
Absolutely. And that's why I've also been fascinated and studied some of what she has done. For people not familiar, they can dismiss it or assume the popularity is accidental. I think she understands very well some of the transition and trends that you are talking about and has built on those, which is why I brought her up in that we can, as business executives, CEOs, study some of these successes and understand where things are headed. Again, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. Not everyone is understanding it and doing it. Now, the other thing I love about you, Emmanuel, is that you're a student of history as well. And you use history in helping us understand globalization and some of this transition you use Sun Yat-sen's efforts and talk about that, help us understand how that can relate to what we are experiencing and what we will experience through this great transition.
In fact, in being a student of history, the one element that we need to add to our strategic thinking is the element of time, the dimension of time, and how long it takes for any form of transaction to come into realization. The fact that something doesn't exist in 2008, which is the time when Bitcoin was first invented, doesn't mean it doesn't have a chance to become a reality. So you don't make a judgment call in 2008 for something that has just come into being in 2008. You have to imagine the processes that it has to go through over a 10-year period or 50-year period, a 30-year period, and then look at technologies that eventually became mainstream in the past. Take the automobile, for example, when Henry Ford made the automobile affordable by making it manufactured through the supply chain flow. He made the automobile affordable. And soon in New York, there were these fossil fuel cars on the road. And the first 10 years of the automobile on the road, all the rules that the local municipality at that time, the city council, put in place was stacked up against the automobile instead of against the horse-drawn carriages. In fact, they thought that the automobile is a passing fad. Only the rich people will enjoy it, and the car moves very slowly. It's noisy. It's uncomfortable. It's just a show-off asset. And the rules stacked up against it. It must not make noise behind a horse-drawn carriage. You can't frighten the horses. It shouldn't damage the streets and stuff like that. And then over time, as the technology became more advanced, the cars were faster, they were quieter, they were more comfortable, and those rules just dropped out of the way. And then as the technology became easier to implement, by 1920, by the way, there were 2,000 automobile manufacturers in the US. So it becomes a commodity and everybody is in it. Today, you have 3 automobile manufacturers, big ones in the US, and even that the rules have changed on them with EV and so on. So when you look at the evolution of a technology in the dimension of time, you realize that first there's rejection, incredulity first, and then rejection, and then acceptance, and then it becomes mainstream. So it needs to go through all of that, those phases. So in the same way, when we look at the technologies that are becoming a reality today in the network world, they go through those same phases. And we are right now, with the network effect, going through the phase where regulators trying to get their hands around a lot of these technologies and the platforms that you were talking about, the antitrust regulators working very hard to make sure that none of these platforms will monopolize the business, the industry, and have the kind of power that they wield influencing society and all that. But over time, these technologies will continue evolving until society finds its own way of harnessing it and functioning within it. And then the rules become irrelevant. So the whole idea of taking a historical perspective is to see what the journey will look like. I would apply this, like you mentioned, Sun Yat-sen, I apply this right up to the level of countries, geopolitics. And for example, what China needs to go to become the representative society that it says it is, but it isn't. And where is it in its own journey? So the whole thing about China is that we think of it as being an incredibly successful country that is asserting itself and so on, but it's got a soft underbelly. And then I have to look at other civilizations and how long they took. So I look at the Japanese civilization and take it from the point of when the Meiji Revolution started. The Meiji Emperor first opened the country in 1856, and how long it took them to about 1990s, where it became the economic powerhouse it was at that point. And then it went into a decline, but it's still economic powerhouse in itself. But that whole journey from 1850 to 1900, when 1904, when the Japanese beat the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, they were already reached a certain height. But the soft underbelly was that Japan was still coming out although it was 50 years, Japan was still coming out of its samurai culture. And the boys were still being taught in school that being aggressive and being militaristic was very an important identity of being Japanese. And that got carried into World War II, where the idea of economic co-prosperity for the region was to go bring your tanks out there and to attack all the other countries in the region. And they had to dismantle that before they became a real economic powerhouse. So China is going through that same phase. It's got issues that it's not yet dealt with, but it's the dream it has is to become a society where the state is validated by society, validating it from the ground up. And that's a Sun Yat-sen dream or vision, because what he really wanted to do was to end the dynastic traditions where the emperor has the legitimacy because he's the son of heaven, and that's why he can rule all of society. And they dismantled that in 1911. But they're still on a journey. They haven't got to where they want to go to. So we don't take them at where they are today. And then if you're Chinese, you shouldn't be asserting yourself and saying, oh, we are superior to everybody else. No, you haven't sorted out a lot of the stuff that you were dreaming about, because it took them about 45 to 50 years just to unify the whole country, because it was ruled by different warlords. And right now they are in a nervous phase where the state or the Communist Party is too nervous to allow greater grassroots representation, because it just costs them so much to hold everything together. So they're not going to be listening to freedom and democracy and all that stuff. They say the word democracy, but they mean something different. So can Chinese society evolve into becoming more representative? I absolutely think so. And I think it will happen eventually, and they will have to pay a price, because this centralized control is too difficult to hold together. People are far more educated today, and they are far more mobile and relating with everybody else, the rest of the world. So the state will not be able to hold the framework in the way they are doing today. So I apply that to everything that I see. And in my role as a futurist, really what you said about the history aspect is that this time dimension, how long does it take for something to become a reality eventually, and what needs to go through before we get there? So those are the things that I think about a lot. And I apply that to platform technology in as much as I apply that to finance. Finance right now is, in a way, in the same phase as China is, which is that the regulators have come in and said, we are very concerned about all of these fraudulent transactions that are taking place on the internet, and we need to regulate them. And therefore, please, when you have any innovations, bring them to us. We'll look at it. We will license it. But what they end up doing is they try very hard to bring it back into the traditional banking that they are familiar with. And they're too afraid to allow new players to dismantle the financial institutions as we know them to be today. The commercial banks are huge. All the intermediaries are carrying on their balance sheet incredible assets, which if they evaporate, they take us on a journey where the whole intermediation business will not look like what it is today. But even then, I have numbers to show this. Banking used to be the most important intermediator, financial intermediator in economics, in finance, but it's now become one of the smallest. So the largest banks in the world, about $3 to $4 trillion in total assets. BlackRock is like 12 trillion today, both discretionary and generic funds. So the fund managers have become huge. And then the platform players like the digital wallets and so on outsize any deposit taking company in most countries. And they didn't exist before. And now banks that have existed for 50 years can't amass that amount of instant deposits as some of these digital wallets. So the landscape changes dramatically, but it's a moving target. And then you need to work out how that transition will play out over a period of time. So the time element is what you need to have in the back of your mind.
And that is really important in looking at those trends that you talk about for the great transition. As executives, as leaders are looking at their own careers based on the transition that you're seeing, in this global economy, in the network effects impacting the financial institution, the disintermediation, the personalization, how do you see the future of work evolving?
That's a whole topic by itself. In fact, people who work in financial institutions have already seen how banks and investment banks even have been getting rid of staff because they can do more with less. The back office is highly automated today, all of that. In fact, if you take an EV car, the production speed of an EV car is 3 to 5 minutes to produce a car. And that's why the prices are collapsing on them, and there's not a single employee. In fact, I was just told by an EV car manufacturer who was making a deal with the Indonesian government that he still had to promise the Indonesian government that he will hire 300 people, although he can actually have a factory with no people in it and have the cars manufactured. So I think very clearly the writing is on the wall that the future of work is that a lot of the automated jobs that can be done already being automated. And therefore, if you're looking for a job for job's sake, lots of the jobs are not going to be available in the near future, which then puts a lot of pressure on the individual to reinvent himself. So in finance, what I saw happening was that in investment banking, a lot of the investment bankers lost their jobs. And then what they did was they went out and became mini investment bankers themselves. They latched themselves to the corporations as advisors and then took them on the journey from corporate finance to being listed or raising capital from different players. So the personalization also affected investment banking. And actually what investment banking is a handful of benchmark institutions, but thousands of former employees who have been laid off, who are playing advisory roles in the marketplace, and they contribute eventually to corporations going out to being listed and so on. I would say that being self-employed is becoming a very important element in the future of work, where your personal value is your skill, of course, if you're a surgeon, but also your network effect. So that the more networked you are, the more valuable you are in a market situation where you need to help your client raise capital and even build a business model and so on. So this transition from the markets effect we talked about in the earlier part of the conversation to the network effect is what's transforming the future of work. And if there's one asset that each of us can invest in, which may have not been ever said before, and I should say it here, is to invest in our own network effect, that we are highly networked and therefore we will find the valuation of us as a worker being recognized because we are networked. And investing in that is everything from making sure that you are very visible on LinkedIn or social media, for example, but also to make sure that within any industry that you're just one step away from the different production elements in that industry, so that the whole process would evolve to you to play an important role. So you can figure that out every time continuously. And what this network effect actually means in the future of work will be very different for different types of work, whether you're doing advisory work or whether you're a plumber and stuff. But all of it has an element of the network effect that we need to build for ourselves. And this is something that's never been told. Everything else, I think, leisure, how important is leisure? We're working less for more and stuff like that. Those are things that have been spoken about a lot. But investing in your own network effect is something that needs to be built on.
Some of the same forces that are impacting societies, organizations, are impacting individuals and the future of work, most specifically, the need for that network effect. Now, artificial intelligence, most specifically and most recently, Gen AI, has been part of the conversation. Some people see it as impacting the future of knowledge work drastically. Others go as far as calling it stochastic parrots. I'm not sure. Personally, I agree with that. But still, you've got two very different extremes just on Gen AI, not AI itself. As you are looking at this great transition, how do you see AI playing a role in organizations and for individuals in knowledge work as well?
The way in which I see Gen AI evolving, it's nothing more than a productivity tool set. And there's going to be thousands of Gen AI in the same way that apps or the API revolution brought us from the early days of the internet to where we are today. But there will be lots of Gen AI applications coming on stream, and they just make and enable us to do things faster, better, smoother. And all of these transitions taking place in technology from the early days, even from the mainframe, has been creating leisure to the individual. It's like the washing machine. With the washing machine, housewife has more time on her hands to watch TV or something. So that aspect is a continuing story in itself. I think the real breakthrough in AI that looking forward to is artificial general intelligence, where the technology starts mimicking human decision making, and there it creates a lot more innovations on hardware. Your refrigerator, your car, the things around you start behaving like they are alive, and the technology is embedded in these elements. In fact, the thing I say in my book is we are mobile dependent now, device dependent. We think that we can't live without our mobile phone, but we haven't imagined a world where all of the intelligence that exists in your mobile phone doesn't just exist in your mobile phone, but exists in your car, exists in your refrigerator, and all of that. And that changes the dynamics of the one device that we find that's important. So the same thing that platforms went through, the internet and all the social media platforms that were created, then evolved into the device, which is why Apple is the most valued company, if not the most, one of the most valued company, if not the most. And even that is going to give way, and that's going to break out into device independence, which then creates a new dynamics that we will see coming on stream. So the thing is that it's artificial general intelligence that will create, and quantum computing that's going to create the next breakthrough that we need to look at. That will be the game changer, the break in the way in which we live that we haven't seen yet. So for now, actually, we are the safe space because all we're seeing is productivity gains. We are coming to terms with the limits of some of these AI tools, generative AI tools. They're highly limited. They're only as good as the data that you're feeding it. And I was speaking to a machine learning Caltech professor the other day, and I was saying to him that everyone says that data is the new oil. I said, no, data is vegetable. But if you have too much of it, you don't know what to do with it. If you have too little of it, you can't do anything with it. If your data is too old, you can't use it. If it's too young, you can't use it. It's perishable. It comes and it goes. So you're only as good as the data that you're generating on a continuous basis and for very limited applications. So it's not all transforming in that way. So I think that we've now reached the point where we are going to spend the next 20 years using generative AI to redefine and make work a lot more convenient, but it's not a self-transformational. The transformational stuff is yet to come.
We look forward to that, and I look forward to many more conversations with you. We didn't touch on a lot of things, including at some point want to talk about concept of peripheral civilizations with you as well, Emmanuel. How can the audience find out more about you, follow your work, follow your writing, and learn more from you, Emmanuel?
I've been doing some videos on YouTube, but the place where you can find all of this different stuff that I'm doing is to visit my blog, which is emmanueldaniel.com. And then from there, I bring people to everything else that I'm doing. So that's the one stop that I would like people to come visit.
I have enjoyed learning from you. Thank you so much for taking the time way past midnight now. It's 4 a.m. to share your thoughts and insights with the partnering leadership community. Thank you so much, Emmanuel Daniel.
I enjoy your podcast, man, and the people that you talk to and the way in which you push them to help reimagine how society itself holds together. Real pleasure speaking with you, to meet you and to know you.